In the heart of rural Iowa, in a small town called Maple Creek, Frank Miller carefully folded an old shirt. The fabric was faded, the collar worn thin by years of use, but it was clean. It was the shirt he wore when life demanded serious decisions. The room where he lived was quiet and modest. Stains of old humidity marked the walls. An iron bed creaked with every movement. Under it rested a small suitcase holding everything Frank owned: 2 changes of clothes, a pair of work boots with cracked leather, some papers tied with a rubber band, and a yellowed photograph of his mother standing on the porch of a farmhouse that no longer existed. Frank was 64 years old, and his body carried the weight of a lifetime of hard labor. His hands were rough and scarred. Cold mornings made his knees ache. Climbing hills left his breath short. Still, he kept moving forward. Stopping had never been an option. Maple Creek was slowly fading away. Small farms had been sold or abandoned. Young people had moved to Des Moines or Chicago. The local grocery still opened every morning, but customers were rare. The church filled on Sundays, though fewer faces appeared each week. Frank always believed he would grow old there, but the past months had proven otherwise. Odd jobs disappeared. There were no fences left to fix, no barns to repair, no yards to clear. Money ran out before pride did. He reached into his pocket and counted the bills for the 3rd time that morning. $56. That was all he had left. Not much, but enough to try reaching Cedar Rapids, where an old acquaintance had promised to recommend him for construction work. The bus would leave at dawn on Saturday. 3 days remained. Frank sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the suitcase. He felt no sadness, only exhaustion, a deep, quiet fatigue that sleep could not erase. Before leaving, he wanted to honor his word. He still owed Mrs. Parker a repaired back door and Mr. Lewis a leaking pipe to fix. That was how Frank lived, keeping promises even when the world stopped keeping them. That afternoon, as he zipped the suitcase closed, a knock echoed through the room. It was Margaret, the owner of the boarding house, a thin woman with gray hair pulled back tightly and eyes that noticed everything. She stepped inside slowly, as if aware her words might change something. She said a woman had come by earlier, someone asking if there was a man in town who understood old farmland, someone who knew soil, wells, barns, and forgotten places. Frank looked up with little interest. He had seen people like that before. They came full of plans and left without answers. Margaret continued. The woman was staying at the only small inn near the highway. She needed help urgently, and she was willing to pay well. Frank took a deep breath. It was not hope, it was weary curiosity. He no longer believed in fresh starts, but he had nothing left to lose. He asked where he could find her. Margaret said the square early the next morning. When Frank was alone again, he pulled the photograph from the suitcase. His mother smiled from another lifetime. He remembered something she used to say, that land holds memories, and sometimes fate waits until the very last moment. He slid the photo back and pushed the suitcase under the bed. Maybe it was just another job. Maybe it meant nothing. But that night, as the sky burned orange over the empty fields, Frank felt something stir. A quiet restlessness, as if life was asking him to wait a little longer before leaving. The next morning, he would go to the square, just to listen. Nothing more. Frank arrived at the Maple Creek Town Square a few minutes early. He sat on a wooden bench beneath the oldest oak tree and watched the flow rhythm of the morning. A woman swept the sidewalk across the street. The church bell rang, marking 8 o'clock. That was when he saw her. She walked down Main Street at an unhurried pace, like someone returning to a place filled with unfinished memories. Her name was Emily Carter. She was in her early 40s, dressed simply, with her hair pulled back and a look in her eyes that suggested quiet conflict. She stopped in front of him and asked if he was Frank Miller. Her voice was steady, though tension hid beneath every word. Frank nodded. Emily explained that she needed someone experienced to inspect an old farm she had inherited from her father. The land had been abandoned for years. She wanted to know if the soil was still good, if the buildings could be saved, if the place had any future at all. When she mentioned the name, Frank felt a tightness in his chest. The farm was called Willow Creek Farm, a forgotten stretch of land along an old county road swallowed by weeds and silence. He knew it well. Years ago, he had worked there seasonally. He remembered her father as a quiet, honest man who loved the land and died far too young. Emily spoke about payment. The amount made Frank swallow hard. It was more than he earned in weeks. He agreed. They drove to the farm that same morning. The road was nearly hidden by overgrown grass. The gate lay crooked and rusted. The farmhouse still stood, but the roof sagged, windows were broken, and paint peeled from the walls. Frank walked slowly, observing everything. He tested beams, examined the soil, checked the well. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried certainty. He said the farm was neglected, not ruined. The land was still fertile. The structure could be restored. Emily listened with wet eyes. She was not thinking about money. She was reliving memories. Inside an old barn, Frank found something unexpected. Carved into the wood were initials, her father's initials. Emily touched them gently, as if reopening an old wound. She confessed that this farm was the only place where her father had ever seemed truly at peace. After his death, the family left and never returned. From that day on, Frank began working at Willow Creek Farm. He arrived early, clearing paths, repairing what he could, organizing forgotten tools. Emily came later, bringing coffee, water, and a respectful silence. Over time, they began to talk about loss, about choices delayed too long, about the fear of making mistakes when time feels short. Frank told her he planned to leave town, that he already had a bus ticket to another city. Emily listened without interrupting, but something in her expression shifted. Days passed quickly. The land began to breathe again. Weeds gave way to soil. The farmhouse slowly reclaimed its shape. Between shared glances and simple conversations, a quiet bond formed, not built on promises, but on understanding. Then one afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Emily received a phone call. Her face turned pale. She said only that her family was coming and they would not approve of Frank being there. Frank understood at once. Something was about to break, something that threatened not just the farm, but everything beginning to grow between them. And for the first time in many years, Frank felt afraid to leave. The next morning, Frank arrived at Willow Creek Farm before sunrise. The air was cold, heavy with a silence that pressed against his chest. He knew the day would not pass quietly. Just after 8 o'clock, 2 cars appeared on the dirt road. One was dark, polished, far too refined for the land it crossed. From the other stepped Emily, her jaw tight, eyes tired. From the larger car emerged a well-dressed woman with rigid posture and a sharp gaze. It was Susan Carter, Emily's mother. Beside her stood a man in a light suit carrying a leather folder. Susan wasted no time. She said Emily was clinging to illusions, that the farm was a burden tied to guilt and nostalgia, that the family had already decided to sell the property. Emily tried to explain. She spoke of the soil, the repairs, the future that was slowly taking shape. Susan replied coldly that memories do not pay bills. Frank remained silent, leaning against the porch rail. He felt invisible, a man easily erased from decisions made far above him. The man in the suit spoke next. He explained documents, ownership percentages, legal paths already chosen. According to him, Emily had little power to stop the sale. Emily's hands trembled. She looked at the house, the land, and then at Frank. In her eyes lived both a plea and a goodbye. Frank stepped forward. He said the farm was producing again, that the soil had been cleared, that the well was running, that this was not a dream. The lawyer smiled thinly. He dismissed it as a rural hobby. Susan turned her attention to Frank. She asked how much he was being paid to stay. She said men like him always appeared when property was involved. The words cut deeper than any insult. Frank felt shame rise in his chest, mixed with anger and an old, familiar sadness, a lifetime reduced to suspicion. Emily defended him. She said Frank was not there for money, that he was the only one who had respected the land. Susan did not listen. The decision was final. They gave a short deadline. After that, the farm would be sold with or without Emily's approval. The cars left, dragging dust and silence behind them. Emily collapsed onto the farmhouse steps and cried, not quietly, but with years of pain pouring out. Frank sat beside her without words. For the first time since they met, he felt powerless. That night, Frank returned to the boarding house and stared at the suitcase beneath his bed. He thought about leaving before everything fell apart, as he always had when things grew heavy. The next morning, he did not go to the farm. He wandered to town instead. Emily did not come either. Silence grew between them. Work stopped. The farm seemed abandoned once more. On Friday evening, Frank packed his suitcase again. The bus would leave before dawn. Just as he closed the zipper, a knock came at the door. It was Margaret. She spoke only one sentence. She said the farm was not alone, and when everything seems lost, the truth always finds a way. Frank looked up, and in that moment, he knew this was not the end. Frank returned to Willow Creek Farm at first light the next morning. He left the suitcase behind. He walked as someone answering a call he could no longer ignore. The road looked different. Fresh tire marks crossed the dirt, and quiet voices drifted through the air. As he passed the broken gate, he saw neighbors gathered near the farmhouse, familiar faces from Maple Creek, people who had watched the town fade piece by piece. Emily stood on the porch. Her eyes were tired, but her posture was steady. Beside her was an older man in simple clothes, holding a worn folder close to his chest. When Frank approached, Emily took a breath and began to speak. After her mother's visit, she had searched through her father's old records. In a small county office, nearly forgotten, she found a document no one had ever mentioned. It was her father's will. Written clearly, it stated that Willow Creek Farm belonged solely to Emily. It was not part of any shared inheritance. It could not be sold without her consent. Soon after, Susan and the lawyer arrived again. This time, their confidence was gone. Only tension remained. The man with the folder explained everything calmly. He showed the will. He showed proof that the land was active again, cleared soil, a working well, documented repairs. The sale was stopped. Susan tried to speak, then fell silent. She looked at her daughter for a long moment. No apology came, but neither did another argument. When the cars disappeared down the road, no one rushed to leave. The neighbors stayed, as if their presence alone could protect the land. Emily stepped toward Frank and took his hand. She told him that none of this would have been possible without him. that if he chose to stay, this place could be his too. Frank looked at the farmhouse, at the fields, at the people standing quietly around them. He thought of the suitcase beneath the boarding house bed, and he realized he no longer needed it. He stayed. In the months that followed, the farm came back to life. The fields produced again, the house filled with sound and purpose, and Maple Creek found something it thought it had lost. Some beginnings do not arrive when we are young. They come when we are tired, worn, and close to giving up. And perhaps that is why they matter most. If this story moved you, share in the comments what part touched you the most. And follow the channel for more stories that remind us it is never too late to find where we belong.